How artists are inspired to create artwork. What is inspiration? How it affects, how it comes into the artist and make them want to create artwork. Now, many people will tell you that artists are inspired by the external environment, by the historical event that they have been living through, by the culture, by the time, the place where they live, their society. However, I have observed that artists have been creating in any time throughout history. Artists have been created in ancient Greece and they are creating in modern Britain. Artists have been creating in times of great prosperity and peace, but artists were also creating in times of great famine and wars. It seems that artists have been creating throughout history, in any time, in any place, and in any cultures. So these external influences, time, space, cultures, do not seem to me to inspire artists to create. They do not instigate creativity. They may influence the tools that you would use, the technique that you would use, and the events that you would describe in your artwork. But they do not inspire artists to create the artwork, because artists have been creating in any time, in any space, in any situation. I would like to show today, through example of works of art, that artists have been trying to tell us, they have been trying to shout out loud and say that inspiration is something unique. It's something which is beyond what we may think. And through the history of art, they have been developing artwork, that is, paintings have been evolving in such a way that give us some clue through the artwork themselves, through the painting themselves, give us a clue that tell us where is inspiration coming from, how does it affect the artist, and how we can all learn from it. So how artists are inspired to create? What is inspiration? Now, to start to get an answer to this question, we can draw to the great Aristotle. Aristotle was suggesting that there is an initial problem with the way that we observe things. He would say that if you look at an object, for example, a bookshelf, what you would see the surface. On the surface of an object, you would see the color. Now, the paint that you would see on a surface does not tell you much about the materiality of the shelf itself. The paint, the surface, has its own essence, and the materiality of the thing has its other essence, a different essence. So in a way, if you look on a shelf, what you see is only the surface, the color, the paint, which has nothing to do with the materiality itself of the object. So Aristotle is saying there is a problem with the way that we see things. What we see does not tell us about how it became to be. Aristotle was suggesting to observe processes of nature, to observe nature and learn how things become to be, how things join, how things turn from one thing to another. That is Aristotle's suggestion in the exploration of what is inspiration, what is creativity, how things become to be. And he put this task on artists. Aristotle was saying, you artists, you're good at observation. Your job is to go around to nature and to describe, to draw, to paint the processes in which nature evolved. Teach us how nature evolved and developed through taking paintings of it. So go out to nature and draw what you see, draw the processes in nature. And initially, artists were answering this call, and indeed they would paint and draw in a naturalistic, realistic way. They would paint what they see. This is an example from Vermeer, work done in 1616. What you can see here is a realistic, naturalistic description of reality around us, of nature. This is just a city, and this is a river, and the artist was trying to draw the river as he sees it. The artist is trying to portray what he sees in nature, because Aristotle was telling us, look at nature, try to understand the process, and just draw it. As if you had a camera and you took a snapshot. So the first work of artists were what we call realistic, naturalistic, as if they had camera, just trying to take a snapshot. And doing so, they tried to convey or to learn about the processes of inspiration and creativity within nature. Aristotle's suggestion is really good, but what he suggested really is to look at the creative process within nature and not within art. And he was telling artists, you should observe nature. Aristotle didn't really care about the artists themselves. He was just suggesting to use them as a tool. William Blake, which is the English Romantic poet, put some more insight into this quest for inspiration. William Blake, like Aristotle, was indeed admiring nature. William Blake was also saying that the best place to create art is in nature. So being in nature would be the best place to create art. However, he's saying there is indeed a problem with the way that we perceive reality. There is a problem with perception. What Blake was saying is that we do not perceive by the human eye. As an artist, he was saying that indeed he is inspired by nature. The best place to do artwork is nature. But unlike Aristotle, he suggests that perception is not bound to organ. So Aristotle was telling us, look at nature and tell me how the creative process operates there. William Blake said, yes, I love nature, this is great. But as an artist, my processes of inspiration and creativity are not bound to perception. So I cannot just look at nature. I can be in nature. Nature is the best place for me to create. But perception is not bound by organ. It is something that comes from within, something beyond the human eye. William Blake was suggesting that we should try to look inside of us to see where does creativity and inspiration come to the artist. And indeed, we see that there is a development in the history of art. For example, this work by El Greco is the first attempt to deconstruct or to abstract nature. What we mean about abstraction, is that if you look closely, you see that the lines are very much vibrant. So he took the brush stroke, and he was drawing like this, trying to break the shapes that he sees in reality. So El Greco is saying in this work, he's saying, yes, I admire nature. Indeed, we need to learn from nature. But look, the nature that I depict, in this case, the sky and this cloth and the earth, is being portrayed by a vibrant brush stroke. Vibrant brush stroke means that he wants to express himself. Because what is this deconstruction art? It's about the artist who draws. It's not about what he depicts, not about what he shows, but about the technique that he is using. And the technique is his own personality. In this work, El Greco is trying to tell us there is a balance. There is a balance between nature, the external world, as the thing that inspired the process of creativity. But I'm going to depict it, El Greco telling us, in an abstract way, in my own way, in the way that I see it as an artist. Because, as William Blake said, the process of creativity and inspiration is something that comes from within the artist. So here we do have a balance between the external world. We see nature, but nature is abstracted. Now, why is it so important to abstract nature in art? Because abstraction is the way in which we observe reality through the artwork, not through nature. Taking a further example, William Turner, in his work from 1844. Now, this is the next step of abstraction in the history of art, where artists are trying to tell us it is something that comes from within, not from without. And how they're telling it us? By abstraction of an artwork. If you look closely at this work, the first thing that you will see are the brush strokes, the way that the artist laid his paint on the canvas. It is very much abstract. You cannot understand what it is. The first thing you would see the personality of the artist. It is the artist talking to us. Only when you look closely, you will see that there is a train here. There's actually a train drawn here, and there's a bridge somewhere here, and somewhere here there's another bridge. By looking at this work, the first thing that you see is the artist talking to us. Only when you look closely, you will see that there is nature depicted in this work. If we compared it to Vermeer, once again, in the naturalistic, realistic world, the first thing you see here are houses and the river. Only when you look closely, you will see the brush stroke of the artist, his own signature. And again, in the modern abstract art, the exact opposite. The first thing that we see is the brush stroke. We don't understand what it is here. We see a lot of colors and shapes and composition. We don't know what he's trying to tell us. He conveys his signature, his personality through the way that he produces art. And only then we see that there is nature inside of it. So in that way, artists are trying more and more to tell us, through the art paintings that are evolving in history, trying to tell us that creativity that is drawn from within us, from within the art, and not from the external world. Here is the next example of deconstruction. Piet Mondrian, 1912. This is a style that we call deconstruction. What we see here, again, a tree. So indeed, artists admire nature. But what he does here, he takes the shapes and the images that he sees in nature, and he's trying to break them and to create the minimalist minimum shape, color, and line. Why does he do it? Because Mondrian was saying, indeed, I admire nature, I love nature, and nature inspires me to see beauty. However, he's saying that the act of seeing beauty in nature is not the real beauty within nature, but it's actually the ability of the human mind to see beautiful things. My own ability as a human being to see beautiful things. And to do so, he started to abstract nature. Because by abstraction, he gives us his own signature as an artist. Lines always existed. Shapes always existed. A triangle is not something that we have invented yesterday. A circle has been there always, before any artist ever lived. And so, it is not the shapes that we are coming to sell, but it is the unique way that the artist is using the shapes. So if you like, triangle is something international. Everyone can have it and can hold the responsibility on it. But it's the way that this artist is using triangle, is using the shapes that give us his own signature. The artist, Sol LeWitt, was saying that if you draw a portrait of a man, if I draw a portrait of a man and I would hold the portrait, when I hold the portrait of a man, that's not the real thing. That's not the real man. It is a portrait of a person. It is not the person. But if I take the canvas and a pencil and I draw a line, single line, and I hold the canvas with the line, that's the real line. That's reality. That's where the line lives. So the art, in that way, represents the true reality of things through shapes and form, simple shapes and form. So this artist is saying, I'm going to deconstruct nature into the minimalist shapes and lines and color, and I'm going to bring it to you in a new way. And that is my contribution. That is how I'm saying that the act of deconstruction is the act of the creativity, is the process of creativity. And so we've started with Aristo, who were telling us to observe reality in order to understand how inspiration and creativity operates in nature, and make it real. Tell us exactly what we see. And artists obey with a realistic naturalist artwork. Then gradually, they say, fine, yes, there is nature. Nature is a great influence of us as artists, but there's also the inner emotion of us as artists, because creativity is something within. And they've started to deconstruct art, to make it vibrant and emotional. Until they continue, and the first thing you will see in their work, the next phase work, is only the inside. Only the colors, the shape, the deconstruction, the emotion, the brush stroke. Only if you look carefully, you will see that there is nature. Because they are telling us creativity is something within. It's something that is drawn inside. And we continue further to artists who are telling us it is not just inside, but it is also the act of deconstruction. It is the intellectual and emotional active act in which artists look at nature and breaks it to pieces. Not just inspired emotionally or intellectually, but actively doing something. The source of creativity, the inspiration, is something that comes from within us. That's what artists are trying to tell us for thousands of years. Now we have an even further example of contemporary modern art, taking this idea even further. This is a photograph of Jackson Pollock. What you may be able to see here is this. This little brush here. Actually, that's not a brush. This is the stick that you would get with the paint, with the bucket of paint, the stick that you would use to mix the paint. So what this artist is doing, he buys buckets of paint, he mixes them with the stick, and then he uses the stick as a brush. Instead of just throwing the stick, he using the stick that he prepared the paint with, he using that same stick to create the painting. So you see the paint is dropping off his stick. So what he's telling us, Jackson Pollock, is that even the process of preparing art, like using the stick to mix the paint, is now becoming part of art. Because life, for artists, is part of the creativity. If you will tell him all that I've just told you, he will probably tell you it's nonsense. It's probably not true. It's only high psychology, high philosophy. I think he just used the stick because it was easier to use it, save money on brushes. But we can make all this argument about creativity and how artists show us creativity through history. We can make those arguments because we ask artists. We ask artists, then what is inspiration? Where does it come to you? Indeed, we have two interesting artists, Gilbert and George, contemporary living artists, and they're telling us we are the art and the artists. So artists constantly saying, we are part of the artwork. Creativity is something from within. As we live, so do we create. Gilbert and George, who said we are the art and the artist, they made an interesting work called the living sculpture. The living sculpture. So what they did, what they've done, they just painted themselves with a paint, shiny paint, and so they looked like a sculpture. And they just stood, and they were singing. Now, visually, to watch that work may not be so interesting, but the idea is that they declare themselves to be living sculpture. So, first they are sculpture, and then the sculpture is living. Sculpture is artwork. So as the artist, they don't say, we are now going to portray to be the artwork. They do not say, we are now going to portray to be the artwork, so Gil Decker will have this great presentation about inspiration. They didn't say that. They say, we are sculpture. The first thing of being an artist is being his art. We are sculpture. And what kind of sculpture? Sculpture that happen to be living, because they are human beings, so they have to live. So artists are constantly trying to push the limit through the history and trying to shout, it's within us. Yes, external reality is there. Yes, we are inspired by nature. But it is something that within which brings the inspiration, which instigates creativity. I was asking many artists, what is inspiration? And they keep telling me that they feel there is something larger than themselves. Artists keep saying, there is something larger than myself, and I'm just a process. I'm dictated to create art. And we have an example from modern art here. The artist was saying that she feels so much inspired to create the artwork that she physically feels she is guided to put the brush in certain area. The artist is saying, like many other artists, that she feels being guided, being told where to put her hand and what shapes to create. So it's not just creativity is something from within, but rather creativity is something which is dictated to them. Inspiration is something that it is told and conveyed to the artist. They are servants. They are being told to create. And likewise, the other great artists we've mentioned today were talking about inspiration from within. William Blake was talking about angels. He was using the word angels. He was saying that he sees angels day and night. And that's why William Blake was very much unpopular in his reality. Because in any place where you would say, here is the Lord, here I am, people will tell you, you're probably crazy. And people thought that William Blake was crazy. But he was saying, I'm guided by angels day and night. He was probably not paying his rent on time. That's why he was not popular as well. But in terms of his artwork and his creativity, he's very influential. It took us some 200 years to come to terms with William Blake. The great psychiatrist Carl Jung was taking this idea further. Carl Jung was talking about the knowledge beyond. So when I did a PhD and people were scared of the word God or the word inspiration, I would talk about the knowledge beyond as if it means something else. Carl Jung was experimenting with deep meditation and going within. And when you meditate with your eyes closed and you go within, you then see your own self. And what Carl Jung happened to see is a visualization of his own thoughts. So Carl Jung was visualizing his self in the form of a spirit guide, which he called Philemon. Philemon, funny name. Philemon, the visualization of Carl Jung's self, was telling him that his thoughts are not his. Philemon was telling to Carl Jung, your thoughts are not yours. What do you mean my thoughts are not mine? I hear them in my mind, and I hear them in my own voice. But Philemon was saying, no, your thoughts are not yours. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, was taking this idea even further. He said, not just that thoughts are not yours, but thoughts are other being speaking to you. And that is a great idea. Think about it. My thoughts are not mine. They are other beings speaking to me. I hear it in my own voice because I cannot translate their voice. The spirit don't have voice. So I put voice into this. If thoughts are not mine, so then we can get rid of thoughts when they bother us very easily. They are just messages coming to us. I was mentioning this idea to my friend, and he couldn't accept it. He couldn't accept the fact that his own thoughts are not his, because we are so locked up in these ideas of, I have thoughts, and thoughts are created in my mind, that we cannot think otherwise. But it's not new knowledge. We knew it for centuries now. If you look at Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, he was talking about how we are locked in our perspective. Immanuel Kant was calling it by the word a priori. Kant was saying that a prioris are notions by which our mind operates, notion in which we cannot go beyond. And he calls it time and space. So Immanuel Kant was saying, the mind can think only within the limits of time and within the limits of space. That's the only way that the human mind can think. You cannot think otherwise. But we know that reality is beyond time, and we know that reality is beyond space. But when you think about it, you cannot think beyond time. Can you think something which is not bound to time? Anything that I will think of is bound to time or bound to space. So much that we use these two words, time, space, as one word. And we call it time-space. And it is true, the human brain cannot comprehend, cannot understand things beyond it. And this even takes us to contemporary modern scientific findings like quantum physics, which tell us that there is far more dimension than we really think. There is far more appearances than time and space. And there's far more powerful powers to the brain, to the human mind. Quantum theories suggest that the human brain actually affects matter. So we started with Aristo, who was telling us, when we look at matter, we see the surface, we see the paint, the color, that's one thing. We don't understand how it works. We're going through the history of art, trying to gradually deconstruct art, because deconstruction is the artist talking to us through his shapes and color and brush strokes, trying to tell us this is something within. We hear an example from artist William Blake, Yeats, who tell us that there is some insight and inspiration coming from, dare I say, angel, spirit, the God. And we're ending up in quantum theories, quantum physics these days that are in, that not that, but also that the human brain has effect to change those surfaces, those material, which then Aristo tell us we don't know what they're made of. Thank you very much.